Well, hi, David. Thank you so much for joining me. I can't express my excitement to have you back on the show talking about your depth of analysis that you do about what's happening globally and the conflicts that we're seeing. And it couldn't be a more important time to be discussing this, because this is something that's going to impact everybody's lives. And of course,
Yes, sorry. A small seating problem there.
is already impacting our lives. So I welcome you to the show. And I guess what I wanted to start with, you sent me some documentation before the interview, and you sent me a couple of articles. And of course, the headline that was the most inflammatory and the one that caught my attention was about us heading into World War III in 2024, a China conflict in 2024, and the threats that we're facing from that. And in that, you mentioned two cycles that are extremely important for investors to understand. And not only investors to understand, but anybody really to understand if they want to really accept the threats that we're facing and the dangers that we're facing at this pivotal time in our history. And that, of course, is the Kondratiev wave, and also a hegemonic cycle, which has always been studied around 100 years. I know you have your own thoughts on it, but I would like you to kind of start there and talk about the time in history that we're at. And then what we can do is break down the individual conflicts that are happening around the world, and then talk about how that's going to affect us and affect investments. So do you want to give an explanation of the cycles that you study and how they're playing out at the moment?
So the first thing I think, and for me, the big piece of the key in the puzzle was to answer the question, what it is that drove us to build empires and social systems. And the answer to that is my theory of human anti-entropy. It's this idea that we live in an entropic world where order goes to disorder if we stand still. The building turns to dust as the microbes eat it over time if we didn't fix it. And that's entropy around us. And to survive in an entropic universe, the human race has opted for a structure where we're all anti-entropic, as in we try and order the world around us. A little lovely old granny, age 85, will be sweeping the step and keeping her house tidy, which is to me the epitome of an ingrained sense of creating order that humanity has. But what we do is we create tribes and family groups within tribes and nations and empires, which are large social structures. And as they become coherent and ordered and successful, they develop massive amount of anti-entropy, which controls the world around it. And then therefore it gives longevity to the humans within it. And a really good example is the Roman Empire. That basically started off with a polytheistic mindset of many gods, each god having a responsibility for some aspect of daily existence. And by the time the empire had gone into maturity and was rolling over into overextension, it had solved most of those problems, from water through aqueducts, through disease mechanisms process to protect against disease, through sanitation, through grain coming from different countries. So if there was a drought in one country, the grain still arrived, and that created the facility to have a monotheistic Christian belief system take hold. So that's an example of anti-entropy on the way up, and entropy starts to control as we are less ordered on the way down. And then the question comes, what happens when a new system rises up? And that new system, according to my 5 stages of empire, has probably gone through regionalization, a civil war, militarization, and then seeks like a younger system, and it challenges the old. And in the process of challenge, essentially warfare unfolds. So the key thing about this is that warfare is intrinsic to human evolution. Now, if I said that to 99% of people, they'd say, you what? Really? I thought it was an anomaly. No, it isn't. It's intrinsic to us. We use warfare to remove the older system with a younger, more vibrant system. And what are the qualities of those two systems? Usually, to build something, you have to be lateral, adaptive, and creative. And if you build an empire, you've got to be lateral in your strategic thinking, which is how you conduct your wars. And if you're lateral enough and big enough, you win them. Conversely, when you start to roll over the top, the system becomes more linear because the lateral people are less acceptable. The linear people become more, there are more of them. They politicize better. They build structures, and they gradually squeeze out their talented leadership and creative elements until they actually stop producing and being productive, even though they think they're successful because they're still big. And that's when they're vulnerable to a rising system that's full of adaptive thinking, has adapted its military to compensate for the strengths of hegemon, and that's when the war starts and one displaces the other. That's the essential dynamic, and each war then begats a more powerful empire afterwards, and each peak of anti-entropy has increased over history. So you can see it sort of as a series of wobbles up, into the history of mankind, where we've used warfare to, in effect, galvanize our societies to be more productive. Now, that is a brutal truth that we all have to accept. And in the periods of peace, we shouldn't be saying, oh, we're superior to our ancestors because we're not fighting. We should be realizing it's a pause before inevitable conflict as the dynamics once more reassert themselves with this challenge of a younger system versus an old sequescent system that's non-productive and adaptive. Now, there's a third element to this, and that is, we've talked before on the show, and you look at cycles which are literally 1/4 of a contractive cycle, or 1/3, in fact, actually, three 18.6-year cycles making 56 years. And Kondratyev's work was brilliant in that it identified inflation surges, supply constrictions, and conflicts, but it was pretty generic. And I want you to reframe that. I want you to think of a pulse, like a heartbeat, that's a heartbeat of entropy that spikes with this entropic pulse. And the spike is towards the peak of each Kondratiev cycle. So what entropy does when you're more entropic, it interacts with the order of mankind's relationships, and it jiggles everything. It jiggles relationships between the old and the new empire, catalyzing conflict. It jiggles systems internally where they have fractures. Everything becomes more or less harmonic, less unity, which is a hallmark of our world today, because this entropic cycle, this surge in the C wave of this current K wave, is now really building momentum and affecting all of us. And the effects are inflation, they're the effects of conflict, and the effects of disunity within the older Western systems, which are falling anyway and declining. So they're very susceptible to this entropic pulse. And this pulse is intriguing because it pulses every 56 years. And if you think about conflicts and you categorize them, the pulses surge through society. And there are two types of wars. There's a relatively limited type of war, a regional war. It can be still involving hegemonies, but it doesn't really change hegemonic power. And then there are the big hegemonic conflicts. And those conflicts really are world changing. And what's interesting about them is that once they don't start at the peak of the cycle, they start on the way up as the entropic energy surges. And then once the conflict starts, there's a feedback loop between supply and demand, and there's more chaos and more entropy. So you see commodities reach their peak, usually, well past the peak. It's a very different, the peaks of wars and the peaks of these entropic cycles are not the same things. So I'm going to give you some examples to set the scene so we understand the context of the wars in the industrial era we've really seen. You can go back to the one we know best, the Napoleonic era. And actually the peak of that Kondratiev cycle was about 1808. But really the war started in, on 1792, 1798 officially. So let's just be really kind and say a decade before the peak, the war started. And the war ended somewhere 7 years after the peak with Waterloo. So that's one war. There is actually a war further back, another 110 years, and that was a hegemonic challenge between France and Spain, because Spain was a dominant European power, and it was in that cycle that France wrestled continental power from Spain. So it goes back further. Now it goes forwards. So the next point forwards is the American Civil War. And in fact, the American Civil War's peak, basically, it started about 2 or 3 years before the peak. It was regional. And interestingly, we had also had the Crimea War quite a way back from that. So we'd had a global reshuffle a little bit too, which is always discounted. But you can think of the Civil War, the American Civil War, as a Kondratiev regional war. So that's that one. Then the next cycle, the next peak was actually 1920. And the war started in 1914. So 6 years off the peak was World War I. Now, what's interesting about these hegemonic wars is they don't last 4 or 5 years. They can last up to 3 decades. The Napoleonic Wars were almost 3 decades of struggle between Britain and France for this power. Actually, the struggle for Germany against Britain as the hegemon at the time when we started was about 3 decades. Well, it started in 1914 and ended in 1945. And you can tap on Korea as a last, basically, struggle in the East of confirming America's Asian hegemony. So that's 33 years of once the cycle is triggered. And this is a thing that I think I've recently uncovered, is that the Second World War sat in the middle of nowhere, didn't make any sense. And it didn't make any sense when wars started. And that's because they don't start at the peak of this cycle. They start as this entropic surge builds, and they just get worse. They never get better. And that's really important because the next peak is 2031 or 2030, give or take, whatever. So here we are, we're 6 years away from that peak, about the same time as 1914 to 1920. And in fact, the reason why I chose in predicting the beginning of World War III in Breaking the Code of History is I figured the struggle for resources with a more populated world would basically squeeze the conflict further down the cycle as the entropic pulse surged. And so I called it as 2022, and that's when it started. It started with the invasion of Russia. Make no mistake about it, Xi, who is at the center of this axis of autocracy, is basically, he knew about it. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But the thing that's really important for us to also remember, there's another thematic, and there are 2 types of leadership in mankind. There is a democratic form of leadership, which really, its origins, as we talked before, are maritime nations, high ratios of coastline to internal volume, smaller populations, maximized by going to sea, and essentially democracy was a product of self-responsibility. And the net result is Holland, Britain. We spread democracy. America's democratic because it was our cousin. And Europe became democratic because it was a more efficient way of managing, even though they were land powers. And over time, they adapted to the same system. Then the other form of hierarchy, and hierarchy goes back to the time of Sparta, the king of Sparta, challenging or fighting Athens in the Peloponnesian Wars. And Athens wasn't like our democracy, but it was nascent. And so you can go and see the Napoleonic Wars, as Napoleon was described at the time as a dictator. He was more dictatorial than the kings, which is always a little bit ironic, but nonetheless, there was structures of democracy or parliament around Britain's kings, and that meant that the difference was really pronounced for Britain and Napoleon's challenge. The next challenge was the Kaiser. And the Kaiser was more dictatorial over his Prussian army and people than we would in France or Britain have thought was acceptable. And then, of course, Hitler is the next personification in part 2 of that challenge. So you can see the theme. The theme we're really dealing with here is, how does mankind self-organize? Does democracy prevail, or does hierarchy reassert itself? And which system creates the most anti-entropy? So this war that we're now in, with chapter 1 being Ukraine, chapter 2 being Iran's war against Israel, because make no mistake, it wasn't Hamas, it's an Iranian war, and we'll talk about that next. And chapter 3 of this sequence of events into World War III, as other people recognize it, but it should be recognized now already, is China's movement and action to take the whole of the Asian basin. It isn't about Taiwan anymore, it's about the whole region. So we're in that pipe. And what makes this worse is a couple of things. If you think of the wars are they are destructive, but what they do is they create lateralized leadership, and they create the most amazing amount of innovation. I've just completed the first draft of my next book, and it's so exciting. It's called Breaking the Code of Wars. And part 1 is all about how we go to war, the process of on the way to war. And it talks about these theories I've talked about, but it also highlights that this is a real shocker, is I talk about anti-entropy. And all of our great medical discoveries up until the end of the Second World War came about through war. And this was a shocker, is every medical advance, Waterloo was pretty much the same form of medicine as the Romans had practiced. But then as they went through Crimea and Florence Nightingale, they sort of understood infection and disease. That process increased in the Civil War because Florence Nightingale took that information and transferred it to America and changed the way that hospitals and treatment and field support worked. In the Second World War, by the First World War, that completely changed again. And so what is intriguing, for the terrible process of being involved in the war zone, the rest of humanity benefits enormously after the war's finished, or has done, by self-organization, new medicine, lateralization, new technology. And I say it because I'm not justifying war as acceptable. I'm warning everyone who listens that we've embedded war in our evolutionary process. And if we wish to actually unroot it and uproot it and reject it forever, we've got to accept what we've been doing and what we are doing again in this current cycle. And when I first realized it, it was an incredible penny dropping moment to explain it as war is intrinsic to our evolution. So we have to find a new evolutionary cycle if we're going to avoid conflict. And if we haven't, I guarantee you conflict is part of the cycle we're in, because that's where we are. So the idea of disarmament and peace and a peace dividend may work on the backside of a K-wave cycle, but it's not going to work on the up face of a K-wave cycle. And I noticed today that, you know, our Defense Minister, Grant Snapps, warned that we could be at war with China in 5 years. Our government and your government and the American government has been so asleep. When they turn around and say we could be at war in 5 years, what that really means is it's about to unfold in front of our eyes, because they are so late. And the reason why we've had this problem is twofold. One is, after periods of peace, there is always a collective disbelief there can be conflict. And there was so in 1914. In fact, there was massive denial that an entwined economic world, never more globalized, could go to war against each other, but it did. And on top of the current denial that we would have naturally as a hegemonic war broke out or the cycle increased, is the other problem, is that we, or America, which this sets the tempo for the rest of the Western Christian world, in effect, this super empire I've described as a complex system, not necessarily religiously devout, but framed by underlying values. That system essentially is in the last of the empires of it, which is America, and America is in terminal decline since 9/11. And what do you do in terminal decline? You stop being productive, so you manipulate and you print money. And printing money may sound innocuous when you get away with it, but what it's really doing is perpetuating a habit that lacks productivity. And you're compensating for lack of productivity by increasing the leverage on what little productivity you have. So if you can get away with printing for longer, all you're doing is you're letting linear people stay in charge, you're keeping the lateral people out from power, and there is no adaptation and change to productivity, which is why you can't see the danger coming upon you. So we've got hegemonic denial, which is a natural process, supercharged by linearity as a product of money production. And if you look at Sunak, for example, and Biden, they are the most uber linear regimes you could ever see in government. And here we are walking into conflict, and they are as blind as bats. And they actually, by their weakness, perpetuate the process, because the other part of my theorem is not all humans are the same. And there are such a thing as human predators. And they are basically, we call them sociopaths, psychopaths, but they all end up as dictators if they are so and they're powerful. And a dictator doesn't think like a normal human being. It doesn't think, that doesn't care, doesn't feel, doesn't think about how your aspirations work. It sees you as one battery in the system that drives its empire. That's it. You can be lost on the battlefield. There is no empathy, no feeling, as long as they have total control over the system. Now, human predators exist, and they're very prevalent. Putin is one. She is probably the greatest of all. In Iran, they're prevalent. And we are facing, as liberal, westernized human people, this prospect that another human being's leading systems are preying upon us. And they're doing so, and we're still asleep, which only excites them to keep taking bigger bites.
I think on the back of that, what's important for people to understand is the breakdown of the economic system in Western economies, which of course is driven as part of the cycle, as part of the Kondratiev cycle, but also part of a real estate cycle. And that is the lack of investment into the productive economy. And rather, you know, in terms of talking about a real estate cycle, we know it's driven by a credit cycle that comes on top of it, but that is a lot of unproductive investment into speculation in land. And also, you know, within that breakdown of the economy, as you get money going into non-productive assets, You also get a breakdown of working systems. You get an increase in welfare spending. You get an increase in homelessness, of dissatisfaction, of the split between rich and poor. And that internal dissatisfaction means that you have a population that turns on itself. And so you get these in-country disputes and protests. And it's almost as if what we've seen over the last few years, and of course it started from COVID, and I know that you have very strong views on COVID, that was part of a weaponized, planned event, and we can talk a little bit about that. But regardless, whenever you get then something that happens from the outside that is threatening to the country, it becomes more of an internal thing to grasp hold of. So the mass protests, for example, for the Black Lives Matter that happened in COVID, that split this between Black people and between other people, and racial disputes. And then, of course, the non-vaccinated against the vaccinated. And we'll obviously go on to talk about the Israeli conflict against Hamas. But what we're seeing now also is these mass protests in support of Palestine, free Palestine, from people that are really very ignorant about what the situation is there. That, you know, when they're interviewed, they don't know which river and which sea they're talking about. They don't know which countries border Israel. It's almost like you grasp hold of something where you can express your dissatisfaction with what's going on.
You're very right. I mean, I think the protests, the Palestinian protests, are a little bit more complex than a spontaneous eruption of discontent. They are basically organized from Qatar and Iran-backed countries. And I had this unique experience of getting into a cab in London and the cab driver being terribly, terribly upset. And I asked why, and he said, because I've just had a guy in the car who's come over from Qatar, is paid by the Qatari government to turn the riots for the Palestinians into as much, trouble as possible. And I didn't know whether to get out, throw him out, run him over. Now, because we have an open society, I'm afraid that's happened. And one of the core strategies that the Palestinians came up with, which is actually, I think all war is a form of strategy, so you've got to respect it before you turn it on its head, was to ensure that the opening strike was so heinous, so disgusting, that the Israelis would be absolutely enraged. They understood that Netanyahu was a weak man and exposed, and therefore, caught with his pants down as he was, he would lash out. And that lashing out would be such that public opinion from the world could be turned against Israel to separate it from other countries and its allies. And sadly, he walked straight into the trap for the first 5 days. And I honestly have no doubt that they overused their weapon systems in places that were really acts of revenge, until America got control of them and explained you can't do it. And funny enough, I think when the light bulb went on, you've got to remember that the IDF are probably the most experienced urban fighters in the Western world. And they lead the world in how to fight an urban terrorist-based organization within a population. And since then, they have been incredibly judicious in the use of force in a very difficult circumstances. And I do not think for one moment that once the red mist disappeared and it was explained to them how much the public opinion would disappear, their rules of engagement are super complicated. Yes, it's inevitable that people die in war that you didn't mean to, but if it was America, I'm afraid you'd be into 150 or 200,000 casualties. No other Western country could operate with so few casualties in a high population center. And we have to realize that this is not a terrorist organization. Hamas was a government of a separate state that was elected by its people, and that state conducted an act of war with another state. So this is state-on-state conflict. And in that context, it's quite unique, because never before has a government, in this case the Hamas government, wanted its own people to die, actually encouraged them to die, because its main weapon was the death of its people, to basically radicalize the whole dynamic of the media structure that then separated Israel. So Israel was in a unique position of trying to protect its own population, and also, as much as possible, the civilian population against Hamas's wishes of having them killed. Now, that is the weirdest form of warfare we've seen for I can't remember many that I think is that peculiar. Can you imagine the Second World War where Bomber Command is trying to protect the German population while Hitler is herding them around the factories we're trying to destroy? And we would all think, well, sorry, the factory has to go. So, and it had to go in the Second World War. So, relatively speaking, I think they've been, as judicial as war allows in those circumstances. And I think that they will naturally and have no choice but to take on Hezbollah next. It's inevitable because they've been attacked consistently. They've had to withdraw 70 to 80,000 people from the border regions because they've been so under threat. And they've removed one threat to their west. And it's only natural that now they're fully mobilized and Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran that they take the next threat, which is Hezbollah. So I think we're going to see that with an obvious escalation that goes with it. But if I was an Israeli defense minister, the logic of protecting my own people is irrefutable. They have no other choice. I saw that, the Israeli government, Netanyahu and Biden haven't spoken. I think that's a fairly good indication of his dedication to prosecuting the next phase of a conflict that if any of us were in the same position, we would be forced to do too. So I think escalation is very much the name of the game. And I think similarly, the Houthis are an Iranian proxy. So as the Houthis, continue to do what they do, and they will, and I think we'll see floating sea mines be the next big problem and stopping shipping that way. They have been very successful in stopping the shipping lanes. Now 95% of all shipping is going around the Cape of Good Hope. That's a win to the Houthis, not a win to the West. We've lost. And when a hegemon that's based on maritime supremacy can't control a sea lane, you really know it's sliding down a hill. It's one thing to not win in Iraq or to even be humiliated in Afghanistan, but the level of this failure in the Red Sea is quite huge. And unless we get control of the situation, there is no way back. And we were far too late, thanks to Biden's weakness in terms of responding. If I'd have been there, the first missile would have received a reply just like that, because it would have stopped this escalation. But again, the Biden regime and Jake Sullivan are very, very weak. They basically betrayed Ukraine in every single way, and they're seeking to betray Israel in some ways. That I think I can understand why Israel feels that it needs to stand alone, and they've weakened their position. So if you're Xi in Beijing, for the reasons we'll talk about coming up, it's his moment to move.
I mentioned to you before the interview that I'm Jewish, and so I've actually spent quite a lot of time in Israel, and I've almost moved there at times in my life. I've got very close ties with the country, and so I don't know that really people appreciate what happened during the invasion from Hamas. And so I wanted just to mention a little bit about that, because it was really on October the 7th, under the cover of thousands of rockets. It wasn't just Hamas that crossed the border. It was also Arab citizens of Gaza that crossed as well. They invaded over 20 Israeli communities, bases, the site of a music festival. They committed the wholesale massacre, rape, mutilation, and abduction of as many citizens that they could find. They tortured children in front of their parents and parents in front of their children. They burnt people alive, including infants. They raped and mutilated scores of women, men, and children. 1,200 people were butchered, 5,500 people were maimed, 240 people were abducted, including infants, babies, families, people with disabilities, people in wheelchairs that needed feeding tubes were abducted without their feeding tubes. Holocaust survivors, some of whom were executed, tortured, sexually abused and starved in captivity, held in tunnels, which is the most intricate web of tunnels that has been built using money that has been donated to that area. 136 people remain abducted, and it's unknown where they are. But the level of the crimes that were seen and the torture that was seen, when you were talking about dictators and how they think and have no feeling, I think people need to understand what we're dealing with in Gaza. It's not a place of peaceful moderates. The rapes that happened, I know from one story of a woman that was raped, where she was raped, another man cut off her breast while she was being raped and toyed with it. She was shot in the head while one man was still inside her, and they still continued raping her. Children had body parts cut off whilst their parents watched. And not only that, but whilst Hamas militants ate at the same time. There was one story that they went into a home that had the Shabbat meal laid out and ate whilst they tortured the children. Where some of the people that were over there mentioned to me, were trying to find a way of explaining who it was that were attacking them, and they said it's the devil's monsters. They had no way of understanding it, and and then of course the posters have been going up worldwide of people that are still abducted and are being ripped down by citizens of other countries that feel that Israel has no right to defend itself in the way that it is doing. So it has been soul destroying for the Jewish community and for Israelis that are living in Israel. They haven't recovered from what has happened. And, you know, I know people over there that they just don't go out. They consider it a new normal. So I wanted to kind of paint that picture for people that we're not dealing with peaceful moderates in a country. And of course, you know, as much as, you know, we're not, when we're talking about Palestinians, you know, we need to also recognize how they're being treated in Jordan and Syria, how they're not being, that there is a border, they're not being allowed to flee to safety into Egypt. There is an Arab world that is not helping them either. And it was an area where Hamas was in control of providing them water and electricity. And because they neglected to do that, that is why Israel provides them with water and electricity into that area. So the whole argument of what's happening is a little bit screwed up in people's minds. And I think that...
Look, I mean, I'm aware of all the things you said, and they're appalling. They were designed to inflame a country, to act blindly, to then turn the world against it, as often, you know, monsters do in trying to make the person look like they're defending themselves be the attacker. And people need to realize that Israel has not made life easy, for example, on the West Bank. And Netanyahu is not the best example of like a moderate process for Israel's progression. So it's the difficulty is that people look at that and think one is equal to the other. No, it isn't. I really don't think so. I think what Hamas did, state on state, was far greater than any other act that Israel's perpetrated or could have perpetrated over time. And I think the Palestinians themselves have an interesting history, because after, you know, the British protectorate fell, there was a war between the Palestinians and the Jews that came in to settle, and the Palestinians lost. There was a war in India and Pakistan, and when the partition came about, they accepted those lines, and they've had some face-offs, but they have accepted the lines that they withdrew to. Somewhere the Palestinians have a different mindset. And when they went to Jordan and they were welcomed by Jordan, they started a civil war. So they are particularly truculent within the Arab world, which is a reason why the Arab world doesn't reach out and help them. It's because whoever lets them in ends up with trouble. So they're all in a strip because they are now dripping with hate. Their leaders in Hamas, there's a very good clip on YouTube of a Hamas son of a leader who got out and explained how the youth is dripped with hate and revenge and fed with it. And what we've seen is the product of it. And Israel has been attacked. We have to be very clear, heinously, and it now has to defend itself, not just against Hamas, but against Iran. Because make no mistake, Iran wants regional hegemony. And with a Shiite belief system, it's very hard to go to the Sunnis and say, come and be, devout Shias with us, because the Sunnis say, go away, not interested. But if you turn around and say, come and fight Israel with us because they're the great devil, that's the way Iran has sought to unite a crescent around Israel in the Middle East, through objectifying Israel as the target. And it is still difficult for countries like Saudi Arabia, who hate Iran, but they've had to go quiet because of the situation. They're caught between the two. And Turkey's response with Erdogan is one of, we're on the side of Palestine because we want the second Ottoman Empire, and to do that, we've got to be seen to be Islamic. There are all sorts of internal dynamics. But right now, it's Iran at war with Israel. And if I was Israel, I wouldn't stop until I've negated every threat in the region. And because Iran is very close to a nuclear breakout, we must not forget the real game Iran is playing is shaping the conditions where they can take enrichment, which we think officially is 87.5%, I think is much higher. I think we can't rely on our intelligence services because exactly the same way Hamas pulled the wool over, Mossad and the CIA by using techniques that went under our radar screen. You can imagine where they were taught those techniques, the Iranian secret services. So I'm not convinced the information we get out of Iran about the nuclear program is accurate. I think they're closer to a breakout. And all of this is about the smokescreen around breaking out. And if they get nuclear weapons, heaven forbid, the first one they'll use, they'll find a way to use it in Israel because they view it as that's their purpose. So there's a lot more danger in this escalation curve than people realize.
Yeah, the biggest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, one-day massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. Can you please let us know what is going to happen in that area? Because if there's any area to inflame international, as it is, I mean, there is no other conflict that has caused so many protests within countries, protests of hundreds of thousands of people on the street, in mainly in support of what's happening in that war and the Free Palestine, chant that's happening. Where does this, well, first of all, we're not really, we need to tidy our houses up, right? We're not really in control of our own populations in the way that they're viewing what's going on. But the risks are enormous of this escalating. And of course, if this does escalate, this really is World War III.
Well, the point at which people will recognize World War III is when China joins in. So it's very, apart from that, if it's in the Middle East, they'll be viewed as a regional war. So the point at which you got to, that's the delineation. But I don't think it was an accident that Hamas struck when it did. It just happened to be Putin's birthday too, which I think everyone's missed. And especially when you look at how close Iran is to Russia and how they share, technology, provide drones, which are now attacking Ukraine, as North Korea now provides ballistic missiles, which are used by Russia. This basically axis of autocracy is far more entwined and working together than the West appreciates. And it's all hubbed around China. But nonetheless, we're facing a more and more organized autocracy system that seeks the end of democracy. So no, I cannot see us getting out of the Middle East without escalation. The Houthis were bombed continually for 6 years by the Saudis with Western fourth generation fighter bombers, which are not dissimilar to what we use on them at the moment, and they're still in business. So I think it's going to be a much tougher struggle. And at some stage, I think the Iranians will try and stop the flow of traffic into the Gulf, which will really squeeze the trading nuts of the world into a high-pitched squeak. And I think that's just inevitable, I'm afraid. So we will see escalation in the Middle East. Israel will attack Hezbollah. Right now, it's taking its forces out of the Gaza into a much more counterinsurgency mode, and they're mobilized, and it's key, and that means they're trained, active. What better time to go north and clear the northern border to the river, to not the river you're talking about, but to the northern rivers inside Lebanon. So I think all of this is just unfolding in front of our eyes, and slowly, bit by bit, the penny's dropping. But the penny should also really be dropping over Taiwan, because Taiwan didn't just have an election that ensured the DPP were in power by 1 or 2%. It was a stunning sort of 7% victory, which is a humiliation to Xi, because they tried everything they could to force the Taiwanese population to essentially vote for coming back into the power of the CCP. And they didn't. They went the other way. And they forgot, for every Taiwanese person that really thinks about joining Xi's China, they just have to think about what happened to Hong Kong. Have we heard anything about Hong Kong? No, because it's a subjugated subset of China now. And all of the capitalism and individuality of 6 generations disappeared in 6 months with the social programs enacted by the Chinese, which use AI to control people. And that's the magnitude of what the West faces.
So let's talk about China, because the article that you sent me was extremely well put together and well analysed and very concise. in your thinking is very precise, and that is around this 4-year plan that China has had. And also, how that ties in with the Belt and Road that's happening at the moment and the investment of that, because that has been massive investment to increase and open up its own trade routes. And what can you explain to us, first of all, what this 4-year plan is that you liken Hitler's plan?
Yeah, so let's go back a bit, Catherine, because the truth is their plan has been since the Taiwan Straits crisis in 1996. They realized they could not challenge America overtly because at that stage military power was very much in the hands of America. So they went into a covert mode, and part of that covert mode was multi-pronged. It was the extraction of all IP from the West with hundreds of thousands of very clever hackers from 2000 onwards. It was the idea that if we gave them money, then essentially they'd become capitalists like us, and they fed that carrot. And of course, the greed of the liberal West, coupled with America and the West's sort of decline, meant they grabbed at places to make money through greed. And the net result is the biggest industrial base in the world now resides in China, thanks to Western investment. And that has now been turned, as it was always designed to be, into a machine to generate an outcome in the current arms race, which means it's almost impossible to beat them unless we change our manufacturing bases outside China, which we're going to have to do. So the plan goes back much further. But what I think that she had in mind was, being Chinese, was to stay below the radar screen as long as possible. And the one thing that Trump did was expose China as America's enemy and start a trade war, which is the first step of polarization between nations. And that trade war essentially put China in a more exposed position than it wanted to be on its timeline. And I believe that the pandemic was the result of that, a release of an agent which ensured economic constriction for the West, shoved our debt ratios through the roof. And indeed, America's debt to GDP ratio is equal to the same level it was at the end of 1945 after America had fought a war. So we all might ask the question is, with the debt level at the current levels, thanks to the pandemic, how the hell does America pay for a new armaments program? And we've seen the price of that since COVID, because the forces are deeply constricted in their expenditure, and all sorts of strange things are happening to the US forces despite their large budget, where things are being cut that shouldn't be, or ships are being built more slowly, and that's slowing down their ability to maintain the status quo as to where they were 2 years ago, yet alone compete with the Chinese expansion. So specifically after 2020 in March, and you could see the signs if you really looked. Basically, what China did was it actually mentally switched from an internally manufacturing-based system that then exported its product to one that essentially manufactured more and more to internal demand. And there was a gap between external demand and internal demand. That gap has caused what we see as the economic distress of China, because they've been living increasingly with that gap. But they've been trying to feed that gap into defense products and feed the armament system in the mechanism, which is one of the reasons that they're where they are. And what's key about it is they could also release the social camouflage of free markets. So if you just look at the A50 and you look at all the things that were free market orientated in China, and think of it as the camouflage the CCP used as part of their manipulation of the West to invest, they didn't need it after that. So it's been falling away. And you can see that if you want to be short of stock market, be short of the A50 because it's in a dire straits. And this plan that she enacted was multifold. It was stockpiling resources, because there would be a period of time when obviously routes were constricted and substitution had to take place. And the Chinese have massive stockpiles of all sorts of materials they need for war, strategic stockpiles. And at the same time, they prepared themselves for conflict because they knew they'd be bankrupt, as Hitler did in 1940. So Hitler's decision from 1936, when he crossed the Rhine, was to enact this 4-year Nazi plan. But what Chamberlain didn't realize was that Germany would be either bust in 1940 or going to war. There was never going to be any peace because of the enactment of this plan. And that's exactly where China is. There can be no peace for Xi, because if there isn't, the whole thing implodes around his ears and he won't accept it. So that's one problem. The next problem is that strategically, Chinese demographics are negative. And what happened was China came out of its civil war in the 50s, and actually in a normal cycle, it would have had more space than it did it did expand between 1950 and 75. It had to go at every neighbor it could. But American power reasserted itself after the peak of the Cold War, and the containment mechanism around China meant it couldn't go any further. So think of it as an empire with a glass ceiling. And the glass ceiling has delayed what would be a natural exponential expansion from 75, 50 years. And those 50 years have put it into demographic decline. So it's late to the party and it has one chance. So this idea of, domination by 2050, man, that's not going to work. You're either in the pipe and you're making your challenge in the next few years, or you're not at all. Xi knows that. The next thing that's in Xi's favor is that one of the hallmarks in the road to conflict that I predicted in 2005 when I started writing my book was this Kondratiev cycle would peak in 2030, and that 8 years beforehand was my estimation we would be in a global war, which turned out to be right because that's the invasion of Ukraine. And in that cycle, the surge to go to war is just unstoppable for an organization that's positioned itself over the edge. And so one of the hallmarks was the development of weapons which overturned the hegemonic power structure of America. So America was based on carriers. So the first place to kill were carriers. So when I highlighted the anti-ship ballistic missiles in the form of DF-21s and 26s were being built and fired and potentially en masse, that was the basis of destroying carrier groups in the whole of the Pacific Basin. And it's really intriguing that we are seeing the same weapon system now being used by the Houthis, hitting a ship as it did today from above. 2 didn't work and 1 did. And that is an indication of a proliferation of a weapon system. And it isn't the rockets themselves, it's actually the optoelectrical homing systems in the warhead. And I suspect that they proliferated that technology to the Iranians, and the Iranians now provide it to the Houthis. So what you're looking at is these anti-ship ballistic missiles, which are not just now China's weapons, but Iran's weapons, and they will be Russia's weapons. They're designed to destroy the hegemony of Americans' maritime power. And not just carriers or destroyers anymore, but ships that are 2,000 miles off a coastline carrying a cargo. We're in a completely different era. And here's the really dangerous, scary rub. Of 90 Arleigh Burke destroyers, which America has, only half of them can intercept ballistic missiles. And none of the NATO ships, other than Americans, have the ability to do that. So they've got a weapon which, when you use it around the world, most warships can't defend against. That is a scary proposition. It's like a hegemonic window for action, which means that with hypersonic weapons mixed into it, the Chinese have every chance of executing a war across the Asian basin and success in very short periods of time, which will be. And the other thing too is I think we're seeing the testing of these weapons in a crude form as the Spanish Civil War let the German army test its air force and army and combined arms operations. So view it as also a test bed to persuade Xi that the weapons work. And the fact an Iranian anti-ship ballistic missile can hit like a container ship well off the coast must make him think that if they can do it with Iranian versions, they can certainly do it with Chinese versions. And the last piece of the puzzle that's really alarming is that if you are a predator, you're always going to pick a weak opposition over a strong opposition. And right now, Biden and Jake Sullivan, his advisor, and Sunak are the weakest versions of Western leadership you could ever dream for if you have a predator's mind. So enacting whatever strategy, even if it's a year early, is better to do it now than see Nikki Haley come in, who's a much harder bag of nuts, essentially, and to go now. And if you decide you need to go in this election year before the election, then you do it early because you want 6 months for the thing to play out and for you to confirm your advantage. So I think for all of those reasons, the great risk window is the first quarter and second quarter of this year, less so. So the last piece of the puzzle is the humiliation in Taiwan. It's now complete. And I think China was very quiet, ominously. So we need to be prepared. There will be no warning. They don't need to warn. They just need to give the order, and 20 minutes later, thousands of rockets will descend on American warships and Japanese warships and bases across the Asian basin, and there will be no more.
In the article, you talk about how Britain has not invested in defence and it's underdefended. I know that you've been talking about that for a few years, that you submitted a paper to government, during the era of COVID, wasn't it, to Boris Johnson? to bring it to his attention, because obviously you're studying this, you're recognizing patterns that nobody else is recognizing. You're recognizing history repeating itself that nobody else is observing. And you're sitting in your own office or bungalow or whatever it is where you're writing and where we all write, and thinking to yourself, how can it be that nobody else is noticing this? And not only that, but you as a person and your family are vulnerable because of it. And unless you wake people up, and particularly wake people up at the top, we're going to be in a situation, well, I think the demise is almost inevitable, but it's like, well, I need to inform them that they're underdefended. But at the same time, just before you launch in, you said to me, it's no different, Catherine, for Australia. And obviously that's where my audience are. So can you talk a little bit about that and how that affects us as well?
Absolutely. You do read my emails. So the first, I should just talk about a little bit about my journey, because when I realized that Kondratiev cycle had started in 2002 and we were on the investment very early on, somewhere around 2005, I had my twins and I was feeding them milk at 1 in the morning. And I'd obviously, if you could see the start of a Kondratiev cycle, you know there's going to be an end. And if you know how they end, you know the war will be a terrible world war. And so I was well aware of the prospect of World War III back in 04, 05. But the thing that really scared me was having more children and what was the world going to be like. And that was when I determined, instead of having an investment thesis, I would share my theories and concepts. And the product was breaking the code of history. And I had to overcome being dyslexic to do it, such as I felt it was so important to do. And never in my wildest dreams did I think we would be so unprepared now, compared to where I thought we could be, and perhaps the agency of change that I could have affected in some small way that would have catalyzed change. And the reason why the system seems to be so impervious to recognition is I discounted the effect of money printing and the linearization of our political leadership and our governments, who cannot see further than the railway tracks they project into the future, even though they're not realistic. And what's interesting is I have an awful lot of contacts and connections in the military who are senior, ex-senior, who are lateral thinkers, and they believe exactly the same thing. And they cannot tap into or change what's happening. So it's really is the bonfire of the linear thinkers, and they are driving the West into a brick wall. And one of the areas which they have completely neglected, and I think this idea that we spend 2% on defense, so we're doing the right thing. Well, hey, baby, when you go to war, we're going to spend 55%. Get it? It's like a big deal. You spend everything you can to survive. And measuring your combat capability by how much you spend is a very stupid proposition, because you might spend it on one shiny warship, but that's not going to protect your island. You need to spend it sufficiently and measure your spend on your defense capability. And we in Britain have not done that. And I think in Australia, you suffer from everything I read from the same problem. You're probably more acutely aware of the Chinese threat. And your Type 26 frigates are far more well armed than a Type 26 county class frigate that we're going to put into air, because you might have to fight, and your frigates have to be able to defend full spectrum threats. So I see more realism in that respect than even over here. But for example, we've watched Ukraine be pummeled by missiles, and to show you just really, I think, how abandoned Ukraine has been, is the Patriot system is a medium to long range advanced air defense system that can hit ballistic missiles now with adaptations. The Americans have 1,000 batteries in their inventory, and they gave Ukraine 1. And Germany gave them 1. Now they have other systems like RST, lesser systems. But Ukraine is a big country, but it only would have taken 18 systems to create overlapping arcs of fire, and they could have protected the whole of Ukraine. Now, I just cannot get it into my head that really losing 18 systems out of 1,000 systems, would that make a difference to America, when in fact it completely protects the Ukrainians? Well, they didn't. And now the Ukrainians, are really struggling between their power grid, their people, and their front lines. And when you look at the counteroffensive that started, the equipment didn't turn up on time, and no combined arms counteroffensive in history has ever worked without air superiority, because air superiority is part of the combined arms integration of spotting and killing targets ahead of the advance. So expecting the Ukrainians to go and attack the Russians when they had air superiority was absolutely impractical. And the commentary from NATO and Germany about how the Ukrainians weren't doing it right just shows how they didn't understand how war works, because they never could. And Biden made sure of that. He made sure Ukraine couldn't advance, and he betrayed them, I feel. And I call it Biden's bloody betrayal, because when the nuclear threats were made early on, and he believed them, and he went into a Pavlov's dog state of terror, basically it coded into him, you can't let the Russians feel they're threatened because they might use nuclear weapons, so we can't win a war with Ukraine. And so the informational bias was won by Putin in that moment, and Biden became chicken licking, and he betrayed the Ukrainians. So the lesson from Ukraine is sufficient air defenses means you can protect your island. And Britain has no air defense systems. Apart from the Patriot systems that defend American bases, we don't have an indigenous Patriot system. We have no natural air defense. We have a thing called Sky Sabre, which is a medium to short range system, not enough of them. And the only thing that could protect us and our island is Type 45 destroyers ringing the country, and they're meant to be protecting the aircraft carriers. So what do you do with a split demand like that? And then if you look at Israel, Israel as a one bomb country has led the world in missile defense, whether it's Iron Dome, essentially against, simple rockets. David Sling is an advanced version of Patriot, so we can assume it's very good at ballistic intercepts. And on top of that, the Arrow missile is designed to intercept thousands of miles as incoming ICBMs take place. We don't have any Arrow missiles in Britain, although Germany rushed to buy batteries, Britain didn't. So it reminds me an awful lot of 1936, when the Air Ministry had this idea that the bomber always gets through. And it was basically a legacy of Hugh Trenchard, who started the RAF from the amalgamation of the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service in the 1st of April 1918. Whoever wants to be formed on the 1st of April, there was a joke in that one. But the idea was essentially the bomber always gets through because he didn't want the RAF to be subsumed back into the army as a tactical air force. And that legacy carried on. And what's interesting is the people demanded to be protected when they heard the size of the Luftwaffe, and fighter command was reluctantly put in place. And they put this funny old guy called Hugh Dowding in charge, who was head of technical development from 35 to 36. And he built the most intricate fighter defense system, which won the Battle of Britain. But it wasn't the government that put it in place. It was the people's demand. And right now, the people of Australia and the people of Britain have to demand to be defended, because the pattern of missile attack is very clear. And, we're talking about increasingly these missiles are going to be mass produced. So at the moment, we're at this very lucky state where, compared to the Second World War, where whole cities could be obliterated in one night, we don't have enough missiles with enough firepower, but it's going to come, because we're going into wartime production mode on all sides once we get through this. So we need intricate missile defense systems, and we should be demanding them of our leaders as a hallmark of the level of danger we face. And that's just a tip of the iceberg. There are so many other things we need to do, as well as learn the lessons that the Ukrainians are going through, because forced not to use top of the line NATO equipment, they are making drone adaptations, which are going to be really, I think, fascinating. The thing that may surprise us is drones in swarms, drones in ground uses, drones in ways that we never really saw them. And the Ukrainians will be at the forefront of that evolution, because they've been forced to adapt right now.
Mm. And in terms of, I can't see that the Australian public would be demanding anything like that, because the Australian public, like everywhere else in the West, is in internal disputes. And at the moment, those disputes range around protests for climate change, protests for, the war in the Middle East, a general breakdown of the education system, so that people, are not being taught history, certainly not in the way that you're studying it. And then, of course, our elections represent that, and the leaders that we get represent that. And I know that you, I keep going back to this war that's happening in the Middle East, because it's affecting my community quite personally, and there's been a lot of anti-Semitism and attacks on Jewish businesses and boycotting local Jewish businesses, which of course have, you know, nothing to do with what is occurring in Israel right now. They're just getting on with their business in Australia. And the lack of leadership around that, and the lack of anybody stopping what's going on or speaking out about what's going on. And I've heard a lot, where you've discussed about how we treat bullies. And if we don't get on top of these things immediately as they happen, they